Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to talk about embracing innovation using creativity to solve challenging testing problems. So when I talk about innovation, I mean like applications that are brand new, that are trying to fill a hole in the market, that are doing something that's never been done before, and then also innovation in test automation frameworks. So for me, the past few teams that I've joined, I've been the only QA automation engineer. There hasn't been anything in place. The application is still being built, and I've been tasked with building the whole framework from scratch. A lot of these new projects are done in Angular2, which is one of Google's projects. Has anyone worked with Angular2 or been tasked with testing it? Okay, and has anyone used Protractor? Yeah, so Protractor is made for Angular, so that's what I've been choosing to build my test frameworks in. Angular2 is pretty fast to spin things up, so I think that's why it's being chosen a lot. React Redux is really popular as well. So yeah, let's get started. So my name's Meredith Bayne. I'm a software engineer. Finally, my title is software engineer. I've had a lot of different titles over the years. I put my Twitter handle there. If you want to sift through all the cat pictures, occasionally I do post things about TypeScript and Angular2 and Protractor. I'm based in Portland now, but I lived here in Austin for many, many years. I'm a self-taught programmer. So learning to code was a really challenging thing, and it involved a lot of the concepts that I'm going to talk about in this talk. I grew up in rural New Mexico in pretty much the middle of nowhere, and we didn't have computer science classes or even nice computers or anything like that. So I was all self-taught. So what we'll explore in this talk is some of my experiences joining these new teams, and especially a lot of the failures that I've had. I've had to trash some of my frameworks. I've had a lot of my pull requests butchered. So I think those are really important things to address when talking about innovation. I'll provide some real life examples. So it'll just be some high level like fake code. It won't be what I'm actually working on. The code will be written in JavaScript and TypeScript, using Angular2 for the application framework and Protractor for the test automation framework. So I just want to talk about where I started. The first time I joined one of these teams that was doing something totally new, I just brought in everything I knew from industry standards before, and I wrote my very first framework just using straight up Node modules in ES5, and when I submitted my first pull request, I got totally shut down on that. The developer said you need to use ES6 because this doesn't really match up with what we're doing. So yeah, let's take a look at what I was doing in the beginning. So just on a pretty high level, on the left is what an Angular2 app might look like. There's some variation, but I'm going to focus mostly on the component aspects. So components are the core of Angular2. They contain the HTML, the templates, the styles, the unit tests, the routes, and then the TypeScript files, which will have like the user actions or things that handle data. So these are the things. This is the part of the application that I need to be concerned with so that I understand what I'm testing. And on the right is my first go-around at structuring a Protractor framework. You can't see my Protractor config here because it's in the root directory, but see, I named my page object directory, page objects, and it was just simple, not very abstracted, and my tests were just all together in one folder, so yes, I'm a little bit embarrassed by this now. A lot of the developers that I worked with don't know what a page object is, so this was a little bit Greek to them. So that was one of the first mistakes that I made. As you can see, there are quite a few differences between how an Angular2 component might be written and how I was writing my tests. So on the left, you can see what an Angular2 component looks like. It has a selector, so this SD about would be the tag that represents the module that this Angular2 component is referencing. And then we have the template URL, which contains all of the elements in the DOM objects that I would be interacting with as a user and also in my tests with the driver. And then we have a link to the style sheets, and it's in CSS. And then I left the component open, but typically you would see some methods in there doing user actions or handling data and that kind of thing. So on the right, you can see, this actually wasn't my first go around. This is when I started using ES6 and I used Babel to convert it over. I didn't really abstract out too much. And if you look at the bottom, my page object, I used XPath. So yeah, how did I learn from these mistakes? I like quotes, so I put a few quotes in this talk. So the great Alexander McQueen said, "You can only go forward by making mistakes." So some of the processes that I really clung to when I started working on these innovative projects were using QA-specific code and lingo, like XPath and page objects, isolating myself from developers. So for example, when I would finish something for my test automation framework, I would push it up and add on my pull request like other QA engineers as reviewers and not the developers I was working with. So they would be people who were like on another team working on a totally different product, and they'd be like, yeah, sure, that code looks fine, I don't know. So that wasn't really working for me, and I never switched roles, so I never picked up any development tasks. During meetings, if we were talking about a development problem, I'd kind of tune it out and think it wasn't relevant to me. And this hindered innovation, in my opinion, because I think it's so important for a development team to just be like one organism, to work cohesively, to speak the same language, to understand what each other does, and to be able to switch roles. So like one of the problems I ran into in the beginning was like if I went on vacation and one of my Protractor tests broke, I got a whole bunch of messages being like, Meredith, I don't know what to do. This is broken. What is this? Where do I change this? I don't know. So that was a really big problem for me. And if something broke in the application or I needed to change something in the application to make testing better, I didn't know what I was doing either. So these were some of the mistakes that I had to let go of so that I could improve. And one of the things that was really difficult for me was if the framework isn't working, I needed to scrap it. So I said trash the project if it isn't working. So by not working, I mean if it's slow, if the tests are flaky, if the developers can't read the tests, those kinds of things, if builds are failing a lot, then it's time to rethink the framework. The test automation framework should get features deployed quickly. So with innovation, we always have pressure from the business people to get these things out quickly. We're trying to make money somewhere where we think there's like a hole in the market, right? So we want to get our MVP out there fast, fast, fast. And if my tests are flaky and the framework is not readable, developers have no idea how to add tests to it, then we're not going to be able to move quickly, and that's a hindrance to innovation. And there are always ways to improve a project. So I don't ever think my framework is done, and I never think, oh, I've written perfect code. I always go back and iterate on things, try to find ways to make things faster, to make them more readable. So yeah. So what do I do when I join these teams? Sometimes I have to face the unknown. So one of the teams that I joined that was doing an innovation project, like a huge portion of the application was this library that was brand new. The only other company that was using it was DreamWorks. I had no idea how to interact with it using Selenium because it wasn't in the DOM, it wasn't interactable, but the business people expected me to have this application tested. So I needed to figure out a way to get around it. So this was a completely unknown area for me. So after looking at the problem for a long time, I was able to remember a little bit of linear algebra and vector math. And I'm not saying you have to know math to be good at innovative test automation, but I was able to find a solution. And I didn't test the library, but I was able to test the application and meet the business requirements. So James Baldwin, the great novelist and civil rights activist, said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So the first thing that I do when I am facing the unknown and I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed is I just try something that seems crazy. So I might break away from old standards, tell myself I don't know, and be okay with not knowing, and just start. So my first pull request might have some embarrassing code in there. It might not be abstracted out. It might get a lot of review comments on it, but the best thing for me to do to move forward is just to start, make those mistakes, and then iterate upon it. So then you can kind of see an example of something that I tried that I thought was really crazy, but ended up working. At the top, you can see, again, an Angular2 component for like a home page. So it has the HTML template, the SAS file, the unit tests, and the TypeScript stuff. So I decided to change around my framework so that the page object had the word component in it. So that makes sense, and it has the same name as the component in Angular2. And then I abstracted out my locators and stuck them in a home locators file in the same directory as my home page object. And this actually made things move a lot faster, because one of the #1 things I found that happened when moving fast on innovation projects was that locators were changed a lot and elements in the DOM would be like deleted. So with the locators in the same folder named the same way as the component, the developers I worked with were able to easily find where to update things in the tests. And this made things a lot faster, so I didn't get all those messages while I was on vacation and stuff. I'm a big nerd for definitions, so I thought it would be kind of cool to look up the definition of innovation in relation to this talk. So I found a couple of them out there that I thought were neat. One is a new idea, device, or method, something original and more effective, something better that opens up a new area, a process that brings together novel ideas. So there are a lot of keywords in there: new, original, more effective, something better, novel ideas. So this to me means that I should be doing some things that have never been done before if I want to be innovative. And if we're doing that with the application, then I should be doing that with my test framework as well. How am I doing on time? Timer's not on. So how do we create these new approaches? This is where it becomes a little bit challenging, right? So I've opened myself up to the idea of trying something new. I've said, I'm just going to do something crazy, right? And I'm not going to care if my code doesn't look perfect in the beginning. So I'm just going to go for it. Thomas Edison said, I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. So here's my process that I follow when I'm working on an innovation project. So currently, I just joined a team where the UI isn't even built out yet. We just started the project. We are writing some native application code, and also we have a web application that needs to be built. And I've been tasked with starting on the framework even when the DOM elements are not there yet. So the first thing that I do is I just try something. So trying something means just trying, like experimenting, putting some code out there, and I just try to get something to work. I don't worry about abstraction or writing like perfect code or anything like that, and put it up there for review as soon as possible. And the second thing I do is I change things a lot. So sometimes I have to completely throw away stuff that I've worked on, and when I first started in my career, if somebody said, your framework isn't working, everything's really slow, and the tests are flaky and they're failing, and I really hate working with this. I actually did have a developer once say that he hated working with my framework. I used to get really offended and say, oh, I wasted all this time writing all this code and like doing all this stuff. But I don't think about it that way anymore. I don't think learning and making mistakes are wasted time at all. I think it's perfectly billable time. And by making these mistakes and doing things wrong in the beginning, that's how I've been able to move forward. And then the last thing I do is listen to team feedback. So I listen to what the developers say and also the product managers. Sometimes I might disagree with them, which is okay, but usually I do like go with what they say. So I guess I'll just go back to what I said before about how an innovation team moves quicker if we all kind of speak the same language. And sometimes I can silo myself and go off in my Selenium world and be doing something, or maybe I won't test something that they think I should be testing because it doesn't make sense regarding Selenium or something like that. It's important for me to listen to that feedback and be like, oh, okay, I need to like come out of my cocoon and talk to people. And then I start this process over, try something new, change it, listen to feedback, etc. So I wanted to illustrate also my approach to innovative test automation. So I think it's a combination of a tiny bit of what I know from QA industry standards, a tiny bit of what I know from dev industry standards. I'm a developer as well. So that would also include what the developers I work with know from dev industry standards, and then a whole lot of unknowns. And that's the part that's really important and fun for me, is the unknown. I like to create things, and I'm working on an application that's brand new. I might as well do some test automation stuff that's brand new. Another thing I wanted to talk about regarding forming a cohesive team that works very quickly together and gets things deployed quickly is speaking up as a QA engineer. So Marie Curie said, be less curious about people and more curious about ideas. If I'm going to have trouble testing something, I let people know right away, and what other people think of me is none of my business. So I work on an Agile team in Agile Scrum. So how many people here work in Agile and have like stand-ups, backlog grooming, that kind of stuff? So during those meetings is like when I bring things up. So I will say, okay, this is going to be really hard for me to test because I need to build a whole page object for that, and I have no idea to do that. Or I'll say, this doesn't really make sense for me to test because it's something native in the browser, and Selenium doesn't really deal with that. Or like, it's a download, and that's not good practice. I call those things out right away. And then I put the what other people think of me is none of my business thing in there because when I was first starting in the industry, I was really shy. I definitely wouldn't speak up in the meetings, and if I didn't understand something, I wouldn't ask a question about it because I would think, oh, they're going to think I'm stupid and I don't know what I'm doing. Like, you know, I'm a self-taught developer, and I got into this field a lot later. So I had a lot of fear around that, but I've learned that it's more important for me as the engineer who is hired to make a good product to get out there and tell people what's going on right away and what's in my head than it is to worry about what people think of me and if I seem smart or if I'm like the best developer in the world or whatever. Also, I found that this attitude, just taking some time to explain like how Selenium works, even to the non-technical people who might be in the meeting, like the product owners or the product managers, or sometimes the business people are in meetings when it's like a really small team. I think they really appreciate that, and setting the correct expectations is like so important. Whenever I exceed those expectations too, then that's great. Sometimes I get things done faster, and because I set those correct expectations, I get a lot of kudos for that. Another thing I guess I'll talk about too is like, I am disabled. I have a hearing impairment. So by the way, this is so amazing for me to have here. And I guess growing up with that disability, if I would miss something, when people were talking, you know, I wouldn't say anything because I just didn't want people to know that I was different. And this was something too that I would struggle with in meetings. So now I ask people to take minutes, and if I miss something, I ask them to repeat it. And it's really not important what people think of me. It's more important that I get my job done. So yeah. Okay, so I'll go through where I am now. I'm going to show you kind of an example version of what my test automation framework looks like. You might think it's totally crazy. In 6 months, I might look back on this and be embarrassed by it, but that's okay. Okay. All right, so I need to look over here. On the left is kind of what my project structure looks like. This isn't exactly what I'm doing right now because obviously it's proprietary, but this is just using the example. I have a folder and I just called it components because names aren't super important, and I found that calling it page objects was a little bit confusing to some developers who aren't super familiar with that concept. I do still use the page object model, but it's more like smaller modules that represent what the components are in the Angular2 application. So as you can see, I actually started writing things in TypeScript. So TypeScript is transpiled to JavaScript. The difference is it allows you to set data types, and the Angular2 world, everyone writes it in TypeScript is the standard. So I thought it would be easier for developers and I to switch over and be kind of in the same little, in the same language. So, and another thing that's nice about TypeScript actually is if I do something stupid, and if I'm writing my code correctly, I'll catch it at compile time instead of at runtime, so that's really nice. And I'm really having a lot of fun with TypeScript on my current project, doing some like object-oriented stuff. You're able to write services, use interfaces, leverage classes, and it's very similar to ES6, ES 2015. If you guys are familiar with that, it would not be a difficult transition. Okay, so let's just keep going down. I have a shared folder. So in Angular2 projects, it's really common to have a shared folder for shared components, shared services, or shared dependencies that you might have across the project. So I went ahead and put some of my shared stuff in here. So just one example of something that might be shared across my test automation framework would be the navigation method. So like at the beginning of every test, I do need to navigate to the page that I'm going to test. So I abstracted that out into its own method, and I use async await for that, and some TypeScript. Then I have a routes file. So in Angular2, it's kind of like a single page application, and there's just code related to the routing that tells the browser what view to render. So for me, instead of thinking about it as pages, I just named it routes. And in there, I have like my /home/about. That way, if we change something up, I just go to this one file and it's all there. I only have to change things in one location, and nothing in my tests, everything in my test is automatically updated to go to the correct location. I have a couple of typical TypeScript files in there as well. So the index.ts is the file where you export all your modules. So I did that, and that makes the import statements a lot cleaner, so you don't have to have like a, like crazy import statements. And then Protractor uses Jasmine syntax for its tests. So I have my Angular2 Jasmine config and a TS config, just like they have in the Angular2 application. So it's a lot more cohesive, and it matches up a lot more. So this is working well for me so far. Then at the top, I have my page object, which I named about component. And now I'm using CSS selectors. So I guess I'll just take a minute to talk about XPath. I really don't like XPath. Yay, okay. Not only is it really strongly recommended against in the Protractor style guide, I think they have it like in huge letters, like do not use XPath or something like that. And they cite slowness, I believe. But for me, I just think it's kind of Greek to developers, and it's just out of date and it doesn't make sense. Like, I remember the first time I was trying to write that framework and I was writing it in ES5, just straight up node modules. I was using XPath, and I asked the developer to come over and help me with something, and he pointed at it and he was like, what is that? I'm like, this is XPath, and I had to I sat there and I taught him how to use it, and then later I was like, why did I just waste a whole bunch of time teaching this guy how to use XPath when CSS selectors work perfectly fine? And I know exactly where to find all of the CSS selectors because they're in the project. And then also, I'm able to leverage some of Protractor shorthand, like that's what the $ is there, by using CSS selectors. I've never had a problem finding an element with a CSS selector. So yeah, that's why I use CSS. And then I have an example of what my test might look like. So the navigation method is asynchronous, so that's why I wrote it that way. And then it takes in a parameter, a string parameter for the route, so route.about. And then once it's done, everything gets going. And I like to keep my tests super, super clean. I don't know why IntelliJ is yelling at me there. Maybe I missed a parentheses or something. But anyway, I like to have my tests have as few user actions and like just one expectation, if possible. Like keep it simple. If I find that I'm doing like a whole bunch of crazy action, I need to do some abstraction, or I need to rethink my test case. Like, what am I doing here? Like, can this be broken up into 2 separate test cases? Is this worthwhile? I mean, sometimes it's just not worth it to test something. Some tests are more effective than others. So that's kind of how I approach testing. And I like things to look clean and readable, just like this. Okay, so I also included what my navigate function might look like. Oh, and the reason why I have to import browser and all that stuff from Protractor, it comes from the typings because I'm using TypeScript. So that's why that's up there. So I'm exporting an async function that navigates, takes in the parameter for the route, and then I use await to make sure everything's ready before I do my stuff. And let's see. Did I already show you guys the about component? Okay, and then at the bottom there, that's kind of what my locators file would look like. It's super simple. It's just you export an object. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you guys. Yeah, please ask me some questions, and I'm hearing impaired, so if we could have a mic, or if you could speak super loudly, or maybe text me your question, that would be great. Does anyone have questions?
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned that you had to like re-remember linear algebra and stuff, and then you kind of, and then the next thing you talked about was like your test framework. So I was just wondering how you were applying math.
Oh, yeah. So the library that I was testing was contained in this like canvas. I don't know if you guys remember like HTML canvas. It was kind of similar to that. And so I had to do this thing where I like dragged one element, dropped it there, and then I had to check that the application was appropriately updated. So because it was like dragging across this canvas, I had to use some vector math, and I was able to use that by leveraging Selenium's actions class. So it was like mouse up, then like move this vector direction. It was like drop.x, and then mouse down, and then mouse up. You know, do the same thing. So that's kind of how I figured that out. And it looked super ugly when I first wrote that method, and I had to iterate on it a whole bunch. But finally, I got it clean, and that test ended up going really fast, and I was very surprised at that. It was extremely reliable. So that's how I use that math.
Hi. You mentioned that the developers would add tests to your framework. I was curious about the relationship that you, as a software test engineer, have with the developers.
Sure. So whenever we're like in our Agile meetings and we're talking about a new feature, we try to go over what test cases need to be added. The developers are, of course, expected to write all of their unit tests, so they do that. And we use Jasmine Karma for that. And then they might have a go at writing the functional tests, and that's in the Protractor framework. So sometimes I do get pulled over to help them out a little bit. But yeah, they do write those tests, and especially if I'm out of the office, they got to do that because I'm the only QA automation engineer on a lot of these teams, these small innovation teams. And then as far as like my role goes, if sometimes like I've written all my tests and there's not much to do, but in the sprint we have a whole bunch of development tasks or bugs that need to be fixed, so I'll go in and pick up a bug and start working on it. That helps me too, like learn how the development code works. I think it makes me a better tester to be able to do that. So I just kind of think that that's like what the future is, that engineers are just engineers, and we do it all.
Can you? Yeah. He stole one of my questions. That was my question, but I'll ask a different one. Protractor versus Selenium, what made you go in that direction? That's one. And second, I don't know much about Jasmine. Do you have any issues with managing a large number of test cases in Jasmine framework, executing, running, managing them, things, sort of that thing? How do you manage a large suite of test cases?
Yeah, so, okay, wait. What was your first question about? Oh, why did I choose Protractor? So I looked at Protractor, and I also looked at another one called Nightwatch. And of course, it can work if you just use the JavaScript bindings. I don't think it really matters. I guess it goes back to my point. I was just saying, like, just try something. For me, the end product that is most important is that I have tests that run fast. They run in parallel. You know, I can put them in the CI build, and that they're not flaky. So when I tried out Protractor, it worked for me. So I just went with it. It's also really well maintained, and I remember one time there was like a bug when I updated it, and I went on their GitHub and I posted an issue, and they responded to me within like 3 hours with, oh, it's the problem with this, and we're gonna fix it. So, so yeah, when I choose like using someone's library framework or a dependency, those kinds of things are really important factors for me. As far as Jasmine, so it's typically more used for like unit tests. Protractor uses the Jasmine framework just for like the syntax, but they have their own runner, the Protractor runner. And then the way that I get it to be really fast is to shard test files. So in your config, you do shard test files equals true, and I run everything in parallel. And so that makes it a lot faster, and I can get faster feedback that way. So yeah, I mean, one of the things that's kind of a downfall, I guess, with that Jasmine is it doesn't support like async functions yet, but hopefully that'll be coming in the future. Did that answer your question? Okay.
In your current project, so how efficiently you are using ng binding and ng attributes? So are you using that, or still we are reliant on XPath or CSS selector?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat?
So how efficiently you are using ng attributes like ng repeater, ng bindings? So are you using any of these attributes, those typically AngularJS application use?
Oh, no, right now with Angular, do you mean like for the selectors?
Yes.
Yeah, for Angular2, as far as I know, they're not available yet, but they should be soon. You do have to, in your config, say use all Angular2 roots. So right now I'm just using straight up CSS selectors, but that is one of the things, if you guys are working on an Angular1 project, you can use the Angular specific selectors. So hopefully that'll be coming soon, unless I missed it. Does anyone know if it's released yet? Okay.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. So you can use ng attributes. There are locators out there for model and all that. And you know, I'm a big fan of XPath, and the reason why I'm saying that is with CSS, design keeps changing. When you're working on an app which is constantly improving, with CSS, your attributes are changing, but if you're using XPath with good functional methods, with siblings, parent, text comparison, and all that, it actually works great. But you know, coming down to my point where I wanted to ask that we are using Protractor and Jasmine, and we have an app which is an Angular app, but behind it, it's a Drupal module, which is a non-Angular app. Mm-hmm. So with Protractor, it's great. You have to move into synchronization change when you deal with non-Angular app. How will did you guys come up with any issue where how do you organize your test when you're dealing with an Angular and a non-Angular app with Protractor?
So what do you mean, like for the front end? So for back end, I will just say, like, I always mock out the services. One time I had a mock service that was spun up with an Express server, and that generated data for me. So I only concerned myself with the UI. So I'm not sure. I've never worked anywhere where the front end was using like two different things, but I'm sure any problem can be solved. Also, like one time for the back end, I just pointed to static JSON files. Of course, they had to be updated, but with my mock service, the same kind of problem turned up. But yeah, I find that made my test run a lot faster. I know that probably doesn't answer your question, and I knew somebody was going to say something about the XPath thing, but I have to disagree. I love the CSS selectors, and I like not getting messages during vacation because the developers can read my code. So.
I think I hear someone volunteering to do a lightning talk about why XPath is awesome.
Oh.
It kind of came up in. Oh, sorry. It kind of came up in a couple talks, but you talked about your wait script. How do you guys go about either using implicit or explicit waits, or how do you guys do that with Angular?
Oh, the waits. Protractor extends the expected conditions thing from WebDriver, so I use that, and then sometimes I'll like add a little extra in there, like logging, like I like to know what failed and at one point. So I do customize them a little bit. I didn't show it in this code because it's kind of proprietary, I guess, but I do use expected conditions, so they have one for like waiting for things to be clickable, all of that stuff, so you guys probably already know about that. So with Protractor, you can just access that, and then I like extend on it to suit my needs. Yeah.
Thanks.
We've got about 5 minutes left if anyone has more questions. Kind of sounds like Meredith nailed it. All right.